Dr. Hanley's eyes widened in disbelief. You can't be serious." "Oh, I am," Richard said, his expression unyielding. "Liberty Health Systems doesn't tolerate discriminatory practices, nor do we support those who think they're above accountability. You've created a hostile work environment, and I intend to rectify that." Jasmine felt a surge of emotion rise within her, relief, validation, and a renewed sense of hope. For the first time, she felt truly seen, truly heard. Richard wasn't just talking about incremental improvements, he was talking about a full-scale reckoning, a transformation that could reshape the very foundations of Mercy Hill. Dr. Hanley's face hardened as he fought to regain control. "Mr. Wallace, with all due respect, this hospital has high standards. Sometimes those standards require difficult decisions." "Spare me your excuses," Richard replied, his tone icy. "What you call standards, I call thinly veiled prejudice. You've hidden behind your title and reputation for far too long, but let me make one thing clear. Changes are coming, whether you like it or not." Jasmine could hardly believe what she was hearing. Dr. Hanley, the untouchable figurehead of Mercy Hill, was being called out in the most public way possible. And Richard wasn't done. "Dr. Hanley," Richard said, his voice low and deliberate, "you are hereby suspended, effective immediately, pending the results of our investigation. Your authority at this hospital is officially revoked." The color drained from Dr. Hanley's face, his mouth hanging open in shock. "You what?" "You heard me," Richard said, his tone unwavering. "Pack up your things. Security will escort you out." For a moment Dr. Hanley stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. He looked from Richard to Jasmine, as if searching for some way out, but there was none. The man who had ruled over Mercy Hill with an iron fist had finally been brought to his knees. With a resigned sigh, Dr. Hanley turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, leaving behind a stunned silence. Jasmine stood there, her heart still racing, unsure of what to say. She glanced at Richard, who was now watching her with a calm expression, the fire of his earlier anger simmering down. "Mr. Wallace, I don't know what to say," she stammered, still trying to process everything that had just unfolded. Richard smiled softly, his voice now gentle. "You don't have to say anything, Jasmine. This should never have happened to you in the first place." She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Change was coming to Mercy Hill, real change. And it had started with one man's quiet but powerful revelation. The halls of Mercy Hill Medical Center buzzed with anxious energy the next morning. Whispers snaked through every corridor, weaving between nurses' stations and patient rooms like an unstoppable force. Everyone had heard by now. Richard Wallace, the man they thought was just another patient, was far more than that. The news had spread like wildfire. The quiet observer in room 412 was actually the CEO of Liberty Health Systems, the powerhouse behind Mercy Hill's funding. And Dr. Robert Hanley, the once untouchable senior physician who had ruled the hospital with iron authority, had been suspended. The shockwave of his suspension rippled through the hospital staff. Some were uneasy, shifting in their routines as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. Others, particularly those who had felt the sting of his elitism and condescension, felt a sense of vindication. But no one could ignore the tension crackling in the air. Jasmine moved through the hallways with an acute awareness of the eyes following her. The weight of all those unspoken judgments, the resentment that had once been thrown her way in whispers now seemed to hang differently. There was curiosity, yes, but also a certain kind of fear. It was as if the ground had shifted beneath their feet, and no one knew where it would settle. By midday, an announcement crackled through the hospital's PA system. All staff members are required to attend an emergency meeting in the main auditorium. Attendance is mandatory. The message was brief, but the weight of it sent ripples of concern through the staff. It wasn't long before the entire hospital was abuzz with speculation. "They say it's about Dr. Hanley," a nurse whispered to another as Jasmine passed by. "I heard Richard Wallace himself is speaking," another said, the awe in their voice unmistakable. Her heart raced as she made her way toward the auditorium, the tension mounting with every step. She hadn't seen Richard since the confrontation in the hospital room the day before, but she knew something monumental was about to happen. The auditorium was already filling up when she arrived. Rows upon rows of doctors, nurses, and administrative staff shuffled in, taking their seats in silence. The usual hum of chatter that typically accompanied such gatherings was replaced by a palpable sense of anticipation. The atmosphere felt different now. It was as if Mercy Hill itself was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. She slipped into a seat near the back, her fingers gripping the armrests as the lights dimmed. Her eyes flicked to the front of the room, where a figure stood tall and composed. Richard Wallace, now dressed in a sharp, dark suit that radiated the authority he had kept hidden during his time as a patient, was speaking quietly with the hospital administrator. There was no mistaking his presence now. He was no longer the man recuperating from a skiing accident. He was in charge, and everyone in the room knew it. The murmurs of the crowd hushed as Richard stepped up to the podium. His eyes scanned the room with a calm, deliberate gaze, pausing ever so slightly when they landed on Jasmine. He gave the slightest nod of acknowledgement, and then his voice filled the room, steady and unyielding. "Good afternoon," Richard began, his tone measured but firm. "As many of you are now aware, I've spent the last several weeks as a patient here at Mercy Hill. During that time, I've had the opportunity to observe the operations of this hospital from a unique perspective." The room remained silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest as she leaned forward, her breath caught in anticipation of what would come next. "What I've witnessed here is deeply troubling," Richard continued, his voice steady but carrying a gravity that was impossible to ignore. "Mercy Hill has built a reputation as a beacon of medical excellence, but that excellence cannot stop at patient care. It must extend to how we treat each other, how we conduct ourselves as professionals, and how we ensure that every person in this institution, regardless of their race, gender, or background, is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement. She could feel the tension tightening around her, as if every word Richard spoke was slowly unraveling the hospital's carefully maintained facade. Richard's gaze was piercing as he scanned the room, his voice never wavering. "There is a culture here that has been allowed to fester for far too long. A culture that tolerates discrimination, that values exclusion over inclusion. This is unacceptable, and it will no longer be tolerated." The murmurs grew louder, and Jasmine could feel the pulse of change vibrating through the crowd. Richard wasn't just calling out the hospital's shortcomings. He was preparing to tear them down. "To that end," Richard said, his voice growing stronger, "I am implementing a series of immediate reforms. First, there will be mandatory diversity and inclusion training for every member of this hospital, from senior physicians to support staff. This training will focus on recognizing and eradicating discriminatory practices in the workplace." A few members of the audience exchanged glances, some nodding, others stiffening in their seats. "Second," Richard continued, "there will be a full review of hiring practices and promotion protocols. No longer will positions of authority be granted based on anything other than merit and experience. Discrimination in any form, overt or covert, will be met with serious consequences." She felt a swell of emotion rising in her chest. This was more than she had ever hoped for. For so long she had been forced to endure the silent slights, the whispered comments, the dismissive glances. But now, Richard was laying the foundation for real change, change that would echo far beyond her own experiences. "And finally," Richard said, his voice lowering slightly, drawing the audience's full attention, "the behavior of certain individuals within this hospital has come under scrutiny. Specifically, Dr. Robert Hanley. His actions, both in how he has treated his colleagues and his failure to foster an inclusive environment, are currently under investigation. His future at this hospital is in jeopardy." Gasps rippled through the room, the weight of the revelation settling heavily on everyone present. For years, Dr. Hanley had been untouchable, But now that power was slipping through his fingers, and the entire hospital was watching. Her breath caught in her throat. It was happening. Everything she had silently hoped for but never dared to believe was possible. The walls were coming down, and the truth was finally being acknowledged. And then, the final bombshell. Richard turned to the audience, his gaze softening as it landed on Jasmine. Before I conclude, I'd like to introduce Mercy Hill's new Chief Diversity Officer. Someone who has not only shown incredible strength and resilience, but who will lead us in ensuring that the changes we make here are lasting and meaningful. Please welcome Jasmine Carter. The room erupted in murmurs of surprise. Her heart slammed against her ribs as the weight of Richard's words sank in. Chief Diversity Officer? She hadn't expected this. Not even in her wildest dreams. She had known changes were coming, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. The murmurs grew louder as she slowly rose from her seat, her legs feeling suddenly heavy. Every eye in the auditorium was on her as she made her way down the aisle toward the front of the room. The weight of her journey, the isolation, the pain of being overlooked, pressed down on her, but this time, it was different. She felt taller, stronger than she had ever been. When she reached the front, Richard extended his hand to her, his expression one of quiet encouragement. As their hands clasped, she felt a surge of emotion, gratitude, relief, hope. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Jasmine turned to face them. Her heart raced, but her voice, when it came, was steady and strong. "Thank you," she began, her eyes scanning the faces of her colleagues, some still filled with shock, others with respect. "I stand before you today, not as someone seeking revenge or retribution, but as someone who believes in the potential of Mercy Hill. I believe that we can be better, that we can be an institution that not only provides the best care for our patients, but also values and respects every single person who walks through our doors." The murmurs quieted, and the room seemed to still as she continued. "The road ahead won't be easy," she said, her voice resolute. "But I'm committed to working with all of you to create a hospital where every staff member feels valued and every patient receives the best care, regardless of their background, their race, or their identity." As she finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Some stood, clapping enthusiastically, while others remained seated, still processing the shift that had just occurred. But no matter their reactions, one thing was clear: Mercy Hill was changing. And Jasmine Carter, once an outsider, was now at the helm of that transformation. Months had passed, but the changes at Mercy Hill Medical Center were undeniable. The once icy atmosphere had thawed, giving way to an environment of cooperation and growth. The shift didn't happen overnight. It had been a slow, deliberate process, one that required patience, persistence, and countless difficult conversations. But Jasmine Carter, now the hospital's Chief Diversity Officer, had become the catalyst for transformation. Walking through the hospital corridors, she could feel the difference in the air. The strained whispers and suspicious glances that once followed her had been replaced by something new: respect. Colleagues who had once avoided her were now seeking her out, eager to understand how they could be part of the positive changes she was leading. Nurses who had barely acknowledged her existence were now making small talk, their smiles genuine. Even some of the older doctors, who had been reluctant at first, were now on board, willing to unlearn old prejudices and embrace the new direction Mercy Hill was taking. One of the biggest milestones had been the diversity and inclusion training. It hadn't been easy at first. There had been resistance. Some staff members grumbled about being forced to attend, while others dismissed it as unnecessary. But she had remained steadfast, knowing that true change required confronting uncomfortable truths. Slowly but surely, the sessions began to open people's eyes. Staff members started to recognize the subtle biases they hadn't even been aware of. Conversations that had once been awkward and tense were now filled with genuine curiosity and a willingness to grow. Even more significant had been the overhaul of hiring and promotion protocols. For years, promotions at Mercy Hill had been more about who you knew than what you could do. But under her leadership, merit became the key to advancement. New voices, diverse voices, were being heard in the hospital's leadership meetings, bringing fresh perspectives that had been missing for far too long. There was still work to be done, of course, but she could see the seeds of progress beginning to take root. As for Dr. Robert Hanley, his fate had been sealed after a thorough investigation into his behavior. The board had found that his actions were not only discriminatory but also damaging to the hospital's reputation. His dismissal had sent shockwaves through the institution, but it had also sent a clear message: Mercy Hill would no longer tolerate those who abused their power. One afternoon, as she sat in her new office, a space that had once belonged to a senior administrator who'd been resistant to the hospital's transformation, she heard a knock at the door. "Come in," she called, looking up from her desk. Richard Wallace entered, dressed in his usual sharp suit, though there was a casual ease in his posture. He had recovered fully from his skiing accident, but his visits to the hospital had become more frequent, not out of necessity, but out of a genuine interest in the progress being made. "You've done incredible work here, Jasmine," he said, a warm smile spreading across his face. "I've been hearing nothing but good things." She smiled back, though there was a modesty in her expression. "It's been a team effort," she replied. "The staff here, they've really stepped up, but we still have a long way to go." Richard nodded thoughtfully, his gaze distant. "I think we both know this is just the beginning," he said. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, taking a moment to reflect on everything that had transpired. The woman who had once been isolated and doubted had now become the leader of a movement reshaping the very core of Mercy Hill. Yet Richard was right. This was only the first chapter of a much larger story. "Liberty Health Systems has been closely watching the progress here," Richard continued, his tone growing more serious. "I've been thinking. We need to expand these reforms. What you've accomplished here can't stay confined within the walls of Mercy Hill. It has to go beyond." Intrigued, Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about the entire Liberty Health Network?" "Exactly," Richard affirmed, his eyes lighting up. "Mercy Hill has become a model of what's possible. The ripple effect has already started, and other hospitals in our network are taking notice. But I don't want to wait for them to come to us. I want to take this to them, implement similar diversity and inclusion programs, rework their hiring practices, and ensure that every hospital we're affiliated with is held to the same standard we're building here." Her heart raced at the enormity of what Richard was proposing. Transforming Mercy Hill had been a monumental task, but expanding these reforms to an entire network of hospitals? It was ambitious, groundbreaking, and exactly what she had always hoped for. "That's big," Jasmine said, her mind already racing with possibilities. Richard chuckled softly. "I don't do things halfway, Jasmine. You should know that by now." She smiled, feeling a sense of excitement and purpose swelling within her. This was why she had taken the job at Mercy Hill, not just to be part of a prestigious hospital, but to make a real difference in the world of healthcare. And now that dream was becoming a reality on a scale she hadn't even dared to imagine. "You've sparked something here, Jasmine," Richard said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "Something bigger than either of us could have anticipated." Looking up at him, she felt the weight of his words settling over her. She had always believed in the power of change, but seeing it unfold like this, seeing the lives already impacted by their work, was more than she could have ever hoped for. "I'm ready for it," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "Whatever comes next, I'm ready." Richard smiled, a spark of excitement in his eyes. "Good, because I have a feeling this is just the beginning." As they walked out of the office together, heading down the hallway that once felt like a gauntlet of judgment, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. Jasmine had gone from being an outsider, dismissed, doubted, and ignored, to being at the forefront of a movement transforming not just Mercy Hill, but potentially the entire healthcare industry. Stepping outside as the sun began to set, the golden light cast long shadows across the hospital's glass facade. Richard turned to her as they walked through the entrance. "You know, when I checked into this hospital after my accident, I never imagined it would lead to this," he said, his tone light but thoughtful. "But you, Jasmine, you've sparked something bigger than either of us could have anticipated." She smiled softly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I think we both have," she replied. "And it's only going to get bigger." They stood for a moment, soaking in the gravity of what they were embarking on. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges they couldn't yet foresee, but for the first time in a long time she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. "Whatever comes next," she repeated, her voice filled with quiet resolve, "I'm ready." A year had passed since Jasmine Carter's world had turned upside down at Mercy Hill Medical Center. And now she stood at the center of a much larger stage. The packed auditorium buzzed with anticipation, the soft hum of voices quieting as the lights dimmed. Healthcare professionals from all over the country had gathered at this national conference, eager to hear from leaders on the front lines of change. Standing behind the podium, she was dressed in a sleek, dark blazer that exuded confidence and professionalism. Jasmine took a deep breath, looking out over the sea of faces, some familiar, many unknown, but all there for one reason: to listen, to learn, and to understand how change could happen within their own institutions. "1 year ago," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "I was a nurse who almost gave up." The room fell silent, her words striking a chord with the audience. Jasmine allowed a brief pause, letting the weight of her statement sink in. She could feel their attention, their curiosity. They had read about Mercy Hill's transformation, but now they wanted to hear it firsthand. "I had worked tirelessly to prove myself, to show that I belonged," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "But the reality was that I was working within a system that wasn't built to support someone like me. The challenges, the isolation, the subtle and sometimes not so subtle discrimination, it nearly broke me." A murmur rippled through the crowd, heads nodding in recognition of similar struggles. She knew she wasn't alone in her experiences, and neither were they. "But today," she said, her tone shifting, "I stand before you as living proof that change is possible. Not just for one person, but for entire institutions." She paused again, taking a moment to collect herself as she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Jasmine thought of the sleepless nights, the endless battles with self-doubt, and the moments when she had wanted to walk away. But then she thought of Richard Wallace, the man who had seen her potential when she had been on the verge of giving up. "Mercy Hill Medical Center is now a beacon of diversity and inclusion," she said, her voice filled with pride. "But it wasn't always that way. When I first arrived, the culture was toxic, driven by elitism, exclusion, and an unwillingness to change. But with determination, the right support, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths, we were able to turn things around." As she spoke, images from Mercy Hill flashed on the large screen behind her, a visual representation of the transformation. Photos of the once sterile and cold hospital lobby, now decorated with artwork celebrating unity and diversity, appeared. Candid shots of the staff, nurses and doctors of different backgrounds working side by side, their camaraderie evident, followed. Then came the image that drew a collective gasp from the audience, the mural now hanging in the hospital's lobby, depicting healthcare workers of all races and backgrounds working together. She glanced back at the mural, smiling at the memory of the day it had been unveiled. Beneath the vibrant painting, the plaque read, "Diversity is our strength. Inclusion is our commitment." "That mural," Jasmine said, her voice soft but firm, "represents more than just a new way of thinking. It represents the work we've done, the work we're still doing every single day, to ensure that every person who walks through the doors of Mercy Hill feels valued, seen, and supported. It's not just a change in policy, it's a change in heart." The room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. She could see the emotions flickering across the faces of those in the crowd, some inspired, others contemplative, but all deeply engaged. "And I didn't do it alone," she continued. "I had the support of an incredible team, people who believed in the vision we set out to create. People like Richard Wallace, who saw the potential for change and used his position of influence to make it happen. Together, we challenged the status quo. Together, we laid the foundation for something bigger. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, filled with conviction and passion. But let me be clear, the road ahead is still long. Change is not a one-time event, it's a continuous process. Every day, we have to choose to do better, to be better. We have to hold ourselves accountable, be willing to listen, to learn, and to grow. Looking out over the crowd, she locked eyes with a few attendees in the front row, each one hanging on her every word. What we've done at Mercy Hill is just the beginning. Our work doesn't stop here. It's my hope, no, it's my mission, that this movement will spread far beyond the walls of our hospital. That every healthcare institution represented here today will take up this mantle and work toward creating a system that is truly inclusive for all. The audience erupted into applause, the sound filling the auditorium. Jasmine felt a swell of emotion in her chest, pride, relief, and an overwhelming sense of purpose. As the applause continued, she allowed herself to take it in, knowing that this moment represented more than just her journey. It was a collective victory for all those who had been silenced, overlooked, or dismissed. As the applause finally began to fade, she offered a final thought. Change is hard, it's uncomfortable, but it's also necessary, and it's possible if we're willing to do the work. With that, she stepped back from the podium, the room once again erupting into applause. As she made her way off the stage, several people rose to their feet, offering her a standing ovation. Back at Mercy Hill, the transformation wasn't just visible in the walls of the building, but in the people who walked its halls. The mural in the lobby had become a symbol of the hospital's new identity, an emblem of the diversity that had once been hidden and ignored but was now celebrated. Walking through the lobby, she paused in front of the mural. Tracing her fingers over the plaque beneath it, she read, "Diversity is our strength. Inclusion is our commitment." Those words, once merely aspirational, had become a reality. A nurse passing by smiled at her, nodding in acknowledgement. "Morning, Chief," she said, her tone light but respectful. Jasmine returned the smile, her heart swelling with pride. Morning. It had been a long journey, but Mercy Hill was no longer the place where she had once felt so isolated and unseen. It was a hospital transformed, a place where everyone, regardless of their background, was treated with dignity and respect. And she, once the outsider, was now at the forefront of that transformation, guiding it forward with grace and determination. As she continued down the hall, Jasmine couldn't help but think of Richard's words at the conference. They had sparked something bigger than they could have ever anticipated. The ripple effect was real, and she could feel its impact spreading through the healthcare industry. Hospitals from across the country had reached out, asking for guidance on how to implement the same reforms. She had been invited to speak at more conferences, to consult on projects that would carry the movement forward. But for Jasmine, the work was far from over. There were still challenges ahead, still barriers to break down. The fight for true inclusivity in healthcare was ongoing, and she was ready to face it head-on, one day at a time. As we reflect on Jasmine's journey, her struggles, her triumphs, and her unwavering dedication to creating a more inclusive healthcare system, which moment resonated with you the most? Was it her perseverance in the face of discrimination, or perhaps the unexpected intervention of Richard Wallace that set the wheels of change in motion? Please share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to continue supporting the creation of stories that inspire, challenge, and uplift.